Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Successful Collaboration Between Integrated Regional Water Management and SGMA. We're delighted you could join us. My name is Chris Austin and I'm the publisher of Maven's Notebook. Now, many of you may be familiar with my flagship website, Maven's Notebook, and its up-to-the-minute coverage of California water news. But I also have another website, the Groundwater Exchange, which brings together and organizes resources for SGMA implementation from a variety of sources on the internet, including DWR, NGOs, and others. So if you're looking for information and resources for implementing SGMA, I invite you to visit the Groundwater Exchange at groundwaterexchange.org. Now, today we'll be sharing some examples of the benefits of successful collaboration between integrated regional water management groups, or IRWM, and those working to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. During our time together, we hope to increase awareness of these two statewide efforts and to encourage and inspire groundwater sustainability agencies and IRWM regions to partner together for more comprehensive regional water management. This is the first in a series of webinars that will explore a range of topics relevant to the implementation of IRWM and SGMA. And while I am the host of today's webinar, I'm certainly not alone. My webinar series partners include the IRWM Roundtable of Regions, the Local Government Commission, the NGO Groundwater Collaborative, and the Department of Resources, who is a sponsor of the Groundwater Exchange, an interactive online repository with resources related to SGMA implementation and the platform for this and future webinars. Unfortunately, we don't have funding to provide real-time Spanish translation. However, we will provide a translation of today's webinar transcript in the near future. Now, to understand your affiliation as a participant of the webinar today, we're going to launch a poll. Some of you, please describe the option that best describes you. And some of you may not be as familiar with Zoom webinar as the others. So while we're waiting for everyone to fill out the poll, I'll review how best to participate in this webinar. There is a menu bar at the bottom of the Zoom window that should look similar to the one shown on the slide. You may need to hover with your mouse over the bottom of the window to see it. It says audio settings, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. Now you're all on mute and your cameras are not activated, so you do not need to worry about audio or camera settings. I want to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box because we have time set aside for Q&A. And also note that when a question is entered, there is an icon for thumbs up. If you click on it, it shows that there is more interest in that question and it will rise to the top. So we will be sure we address that question. And keep an eye on the chat box because links to resources that speakers are talking about and other pertinent information will appear here. Our Q&A and chat box are being managed by the awesome Emily Finnegan at the Local Government Commission. And those of you who are on the phone rather than the webinar, you can send your questions to Maven at mavensnotebook.com and I will add them to the queue. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. Okay, well, we have a wide variety of people here today and even some tribe members, so that's great. I think we're going to have a lot of good information. So, I'll share these results. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's get started. Our moderator for today's panel is Lance Eckhart, General Manager of the San Gorgonio Pass Water Agency, a state water project contractor. Lance has worked in the public and private sectors during his 25 years of experience in water resources management. Prior to his employment at San Gorgonio Pass Water Agency, he was employed for 18 years at the Mojave Water Agency as the Director of Basin Management and Resource Planning. At Mojave, Lance acted as the program coordinator for the region's integrated regional water management plan. One of the plan's successes was the development of a very successful small water system disadvantaged community program through a partnership with the nonprofit Cal Rural Water Association. The program assisted over 40 small water systems in the region. Mr. Eckhart received his Bachelor of Science degree in geology and a Master of Science degree in environmental science from the California State University at Fullerton. He is a licensed professional geologist and a certified hydrogeologist in the state of California. Okay, Lance, I'm handing it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and I appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon. So I'm going to kick us off with talking about integrated plans and kind of setting the stage of how integrated plans and SGMA kind of compare and contrast and how they work together. Both of these programs are intended to manage water resources in the state of California. And you see managing by watershed, managing by region, all throughout the California Water Plan and the resiliency portfolio. But these programs, they're different. They've got a different history, and SGMA is just taking off and starting to take hold and get real. We're past the honeymoon period of passing the law and doing things and creating governance, and now we're getting to the point where we have to measure stuff and make decisions. And that's really where I think these two programs can mesh. But let's go into a little bit of the history of integrated plans. Started back in 2002 as part of the Regional Water Management Planning Act 1672. Now, integrated plans was kind of like an ethos of doing things a little bit differently. The water industry is traditionally very siloed, and this is a voluntary program to try to break down those silos and get everybody talking. The supply folks, the retail folks, flood, wastewater, regional water quality control boards, state boards, special interest groups, environmental groups, get everybody at the big table and try to think of collaborative solutions that just make sense and are greater than the sum of its parts. Started out with the state trying to entice folks with money from Prop 50, Prop 84, and Prop 1 to kind of keep people at that big table and really kind of keep this multi-benefit stakeholder approach going. To date, $1.5 billion of state funding has been provided to support integrated plans, but that money is starting to wane in the latest bond initiatives, and more emphasis is on SGMA, and for obvious reasons that I'll go into shortly. I would say that over the past almost 20 years, integrated plans have been really effective. There's been about a 4-to-1 ratio of local money for match for integrated planning grant money. And it shows that people are pretty serious about it and putting their money where their mouth is on working together and having these collaborative multi-benefit projects. SGMA, one of the things I say is SGMA's taken all the air out of the room when compared to integrated plans. And I think if that happens, that's going to be a shame. We have 48 integrated plans across the state that cover 99% of the population and 87% of the state's area. So this is a really well-established 2-decade program that really is very relevant and still needs to garner attention, and has a role in California water. Now let's flip to SGMA. If you're like 30 million people in California, there's groundwater underneath your feet. Groundwater is a critical buffer for drought proofing or making ourselves drought resilient. Groundwater didn't get the respect it deserved for almost 100 years. Back in 1914, with the Water Commission Act, which later turned into the state board, we established water rights, surface water rights. And it took us about 100 years to catch up to SGMA in 2014 with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And that really is, the reason is, well, there's lots of reasons. One of the reasons is it's easy to measure surface water. You can see it, and it's really hard to understand and manage groundwater because you can't see it. And so it took us about a century to get to the point where we understand we had to manage both of those resources. Now, with the 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, approximately 260 groundwater sustainability agencies, that's potentially new silos, new governance structures, local governance structures were developed to help manage the individual groundwater basins that are in various regions across the state. Part of the process of creating a groundwater sustainability agency is you have to create a groundwater sustainability plan. In that plan, you have to measure how much water is going in, how much water is going out, and develop management actions or projects to do things to avoid undesirable results, like don't use up all your water, preserve the water quality, don't suck in the ocean with seawater intrusion. Don't have subsidence come in and, and cause a bunch of damage, really basic stuff. But it's getting to the point now where those projects are starting to become real. Those management actions are becoming real, and we have to do things. So now local water managers have these two frameworks to deal with. You've got the integrated plan, which is a voluntary process that's pretty effective in certain areas. And then you've got SGMA, which is not a voluntary process. And the reason maybe integrated plans aren't getting the attention they deserve is integrated plan is a warm hug. You work together, we're gonna collaborate, it's voluntary, and SGMA is a regulatory process. So there's somebody with a stick looking at you, making sure you're doing your job. And if you're gonna give attention, are you gonna look at the person that wants to give you the hug or the person that's holding the stick and looking at you? Probably the person with the stick. And so that's why I believe that SGMA's probably taken the air out of the room with integrated plans. I don't think it has to be that way. I'm hoping the discussion kind of talks about how those things can meld together about we have the regulation to make sure we do what we're supposed to do, or there's a person with a stick that's going to hit us. But can we do it better, and can we collaborate along the way? So with that, I'm going to transition into the speakers today. First, I want to introduce Rob Schwartz. Rob is a manager of technical services with the Regional Water Authority of Sacramento. Rob's responsibilities include managing the American River Basin Integrated Regional Water Management Plan and the local Sustainable Groundwater Agency. Prior to joining the authorities back in 2003, Rob was with the California Department of Water Resources, where he co-authored the 2003 update to Bulletin 118. He's a professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist in California, so we're in good company. Next, I want to introduce David Orth of Clovis. He's the principal of New Current Water and Land LLC, which offers strategic and water resources development services. He's got nearly 40 years of financial and management experience, serving previously as the general manager of the Kings River Conservation District, executive officer of the Friant North Authority, and director of finance and general manager positions at Westlands Water District. Orth is also a member of the sat as a member of the California Water Commission, appointed by Governor Brown in 2014, expired in 2018. And lastly, we have Angela Islas. She's the community development specialist with Self-Help Enterprises. Since 1965, Self-Help has worked throughout the 8 counties of San Joaquin Valley and working with low-income families to build and sustain healthy homes and communities. Angela works with the community engagement planning team at Self-Help and works to support community participation in regional water management and groundwater sustainability planning. She's currently leading the overall sustainable groundwater management work for outreach and engagement, and is leading project efforts at the Madera Regional Water Management Group in the Madera Integrated Regional Water Management Plan region. So with that, I'm going to open this up to some questions. Actually, if the speakers could open themselves, actually, sorry. Rob, why don't you go first?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. So I represent the American River Basin, which is really, it's actually the portion of 2 watersheds, the Sacramento Valley portions of the Lower American River and the Cosumnes River. We cover about 1,250 square miles in almost all of Sacramento County and the western portions of Placer and El Dorado counties. Within that area, we also cover 3 groundwater subbasins. So from north to south, we have the North American subbasin, the South American subbasin, and the Cosumnes subbasin. So what I want you to know about our region is we've really been doing IRWM and SGMA before they were cool. So Lance, there's a country song in there I'm sure you'd enjoy, but we basically, going back to the 70s and 80s, this was an area that was really rife with conflict because we were growing substantially and increasing our diversions up the Lower American River, while at the same time, the ecosystem in the Lower American River was crashing. So in 1993, we all came together in a process called the Water Forum, and that included groups representing water supply interests, the environment, business, and local government. And this group went through a 7-year process to develop a truly integrated plan that would allow for growth through the year 2030, but also protecting the Lower American River. And so really that required a lot of integration. And basically the river, what it got was establishment of a flow standard to ensure that particularly during dry times, habitat was protected. In addition to that, we have a habitat restoration programs that have been committed to on the Lower American River. What the water suppliers got on their side was permission to increase their diversions to meet that demand out to 2030. But in exchange, agreed during dry years to reduce that demand all the way back to the 1990s levels. And so to do that, you really need to have alternatives. And one of those was actually increasing water use efficiency. So it's simply reducing your demand overall. The other is to rely then on our other primary source in the region, that's groundwater. So groundwater at that time really wasn't in very good shape. We did have declining water levels. We had some overdraft. We certainly have a lot of contamination associated with prior Air Force, defense industry activities and such, and Aerojet. So we had to establish groundwater management throughout the basin as well, so that was there and available as our backup supply. So coming out of the water reform process, you ultimately have these two organizations that I have the privilege of working for that get established. So in 1998, the Sacramento Groundwater Authority got established through a joint powers agreement between the cities of Citrus Heights, Sacramento, and Folsom, and Sacramento County, using their common police powers to manage the northern portion of Sacramento County. What was interesting is they established a board of directors that had 16 agencies on it, including self-supplied agriculture, self-supplied commercial industrial, and investor-owned utilities. So really this joint powers authority in a lot of ways became one of the models when SGMA was established. So we were sort of pre-SGMA doing those kinds of things that you're seeing happen today. In addition to that, then in 2001, the Regional Water Authority formed, and that was really of the water suppliers that made this commitment to the water reform agreement, seeking help with a local planning agency of and by themselves, basically, to implement that agreement. So we established a regional water efficiency program, which has been successfully run since that time. And what we really do is a lot of regional planning and securing of grant funding to help agencies build these types of projects so that they can expand conjunctive use, so that in the dry years, we can rely primarily on groundwater and then turn around and rely on surface water. So again, as IRWM came into play, we were naturally situated, both organizations, to become both the Groundwater Sustainability Agency and the Regional Water Management Group. So that's the introduction I'd like to give. Thanks.
All right, David, I think you're up.
Thank you, Lance, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lance mentioned, I've actually spent my career in California water, starting in the Westlands Water District in Western Fresno County, and then after a short stint with a family-owned agricultural organization in Westlands, I became the general manager of Kings River Conservation District, where I served until 2015. I then, quote, retired to my current position as a strategic water consultant and principal at New Current Water and Land. Well, my career originally focused on central San Joaquin Valley water issues in the critically overdrafted West Side and Kings groundwater subbasins. I now find myself involved in monitoring SGMA implementation in over 60, nearly 70 groundwater sustainability agencies in about 40 subbasins statewide on behalf of our various ag, finance, and environmental clients. My experience with groundwater management goes back a while, having managed the development implementation of, Lance, I forget what you called those, but they were the groundwater management plans that were created under AB 3030 or SB 1938. And I oversaw the management, development, and implementation of those plans at Westlands and at Kings River. While at Kings River Conservation District, our board and management team, in looking at the participant list, I see several of them on this webinar today, and I want to acknowledge their hard work. We worked with local agencies to create the Kings Basin Water Authority, which is a joint powers agency consisting of about 17 local agencies, cities, counties, water districts, and supported by over 40 what we called interested parties, which were, again, local agencies and other stakeholder representatives, to create, the authority then created an integrated regional water management plan for the Kings groundwater basin. It was a decade-long process, frankly. The authority was created after a multi-year public forum discussion that began in 2001 that focused on creating an awareness and then a vision amongst the various stakeholders for the Kings Groundwater Basin. I believe the original IRWM was prepared and approved in 2007, and then the authority was formed shortly thereafter as the governance agency to implement that plan. And clearly, sustainable groundwater management, it remains the key foundation element of the Kings Basin integrated planning process. In 2013, as chairman of the Association of California Water Agencies Groundwater Committee, I found myself deeply involved in groundwater management discussions, first at the policy level through AQUA and the California Water Foundation, which both prepared key policy reports that ultimately informed the legislative process that led to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I sat at the governor's table in his conference room and through multiple meetings and discussions assisted in the drafting of the act itself, proposed amendments that were adopted in 2015, and then as a seated member of the California Water Commission, worked with the Department of Water Resources staff in the development of the implementing SGMA regulations. So I have a pretty good feel for purpose and intent of the Groundwater Act. During the development of SGMA, as I said in those negotiation sessions, I had some pretty strong feelings and opinions on how I saw integrated planning and the IRWM program and the requirements of SGMA complementing each other and could likely align the interests of both this carrot and the stick approach. Unfortunately, my expectations have fallen short, and I know we'll discuss that a little bit further today. I'm looking forward to this webinar and contributing to discussion of opportunities on how to reconnect and leverage some of those common objectives to better outcomes.
All right. Thank you, David. Angela, I think this is you. You're up.
Pressure's on me. Yeah, so prior to working with self-help, I actually was not in the water world. I kind of had a background in public health and air quality. So I was originally working for a nonprofit around 2017, kind of distributing out a free asthma and asthma impact model service for low-income families in Fresno County and Madera County to receive indoor asthma kind of education and services for those that are struggling with controlling their asthma. So I kind of flipped a lot from going into air quality advocacy all the way to water advocacy. So I began my work with SGMA and IRWM at the end of 2019. I was kind of helping with kind of the last push for GSP development and organizing workshops in some of the communities, with Madera Subbasin being one of those, and in North Fork Kings GSA to really encourage residents to be able to provide their feedback on their GSPs with the GSAs that they are within. And I then began my work as well with Madera, IRWM, and self-help has been supporting that work since 2018, supporting with implementing a disadvantaged community capacity building program and kind of building an opportunity for residents to join a coordination group in order to bring more disadvantaged community needs to the IRWM group, and also implementing a pilot program to begin a water testing service within the Madera IRWM region. So we do a lot of extensive work with communities in that extent, but we also do a lot of work in the Tulare Kern funding area. And part of the work there is implementing a disadvantaged community education program, and that really helps with kind of developing materials and being able to engage more disadvantaged communities within the Tulare Kern funding area, particularly in the wide area communities and also with tribal communities. And then also lastly, we do work, not as extensive, but we had taken the opportunity to implement a program that's called Drinking Water for Schools. So that program really has helped about 30 school districts be able to receive technical assistance to receive new drinking water fountains, or to be able to help with pipeline remediations, and bringing clean drinking water to schools that actually came out with high contaminants that serve the children within the school grounds. So we do a lot in community engagement, but our primary goal is to really allow a space for residents in rural areas to be able to participate fully in planning, and for them to be able to bring their on the ground experience to kind of influence a decision-making process to really be able to bring clean and accessible water into their communities. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Rob, David, Angela, thank you very much for your background. We're going to go into some questions that we have pre-planned, and then and get a little dialogue going, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A with the group. But first question's for Rob. You've been involved with integrated plans and now SGMA for the last 15 years. Have you seen water management change over time? And like in the broadest of strokes, what have you learned? What works? What doesn't work?
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me I've been doing this long. It's actually longer than that. But to really kind of go back over 15 years in thinking about this, I kind of had to think about it in terms of more like themes. And they sort of follow a timeline. But I think with IRWM and the ways that I've seen it change, the first is increased formalization. And what I mean by that is, when SB 1672 passed, and you alluded to this earlier, in 2002, it was really just a law that said, hey, 2 or more agencies that have some authority to do some planning should get together and try to integrate. And, an example of an agency with an urban water management plan and an ag water management plan, and that would constitute progress. It said the state should provide priority for funding coming out of programs if you do that. So it's a very voluntary process, very ad hoc. Then you eventually have Prop 50 pass, and now you really start to get these first guidelines that are starting to come out in the 2005, 2006 timeframe. And they're starting to start working with some stakeholders, but there's really no definition of how extensive this should be around the state. What we saw was a lot of overlap of water management, and at the time they weren't called regional water management groups. So you just kind of had this ad hoc and organized areas like myself. I will admit we were in a great position, and we developed our plans, and we got a lot of funding out of these bonds. But really the next iteration comes around from Prop 84. And now the process becomes much more formal. You really get much more inclusive with the groups of stakeholders, for example. But now the state actually goes to the level of defining this region acceptance process. Many of you remember participating in this around 2009. Where agencies actually had to go and justify, how were you the regional water management group? And one of the big keys there was to demonstrate that you were working with the local stakeholders and that there wasn't overlap and repetition. And ultimately, that's how we arrive at where we are today with the 48 regional water management groups. So again, that's the first thing that I've observed, is that I call it formalization. The second theme, in my mind, and particularly locally, this applied to me, was trust building. So again, back when we did our first plan, we were just water agencies. As I mentioned, we did the water form agreement. We thought we had all the stakeholders that we needed in the room already. But it turns out it's much broader than just trying to protect our lower American river system in our region. And so we were really kind of surprised when Prop 84 came out, and we started doing an update to our water management plan in 2009. And we sat down with the stakeholders and we said, here's our 6-month timeline for updating the plan with the checklist of things that DWR wants to have. And really a lot of our small watershed stakeholders said, put the brakes on. Let's get, what is our mission, goal, objectives? We want to start everything from scratch. What you've done to date it isn't good enough. And so we really went through a very lengthy process ultimately 4 years to update that plan and arrive at an integrated plan in 2013. And along the way, we took our time and we built a lot of trust. And eventually we're now at a 2018 plan that we recently adopted. And I'd really like to think that we show the representation of the entire watershed. It's not strictly a water supply centric plan. And I think that, again, our stakeholders through these years, they've remained engaged. We still meet twice a year, and I still have great attendance, even when we're not updating the plan or pursuing fundings. So really, that's been a big issue, and I think that that's been a lot of experience of other areas around the state as well. Another theme is frustration. Now, again, as I said, I'm not going to speak for myself. This is what I'm hearing from other regional water management groups, because we've been very successful. But a lot of these regional water management groups formed, in particular, even after Prop 50, with the expectation of coming up with these plans and then having access to the funding. And we certainly noticed in the Sacramento River hydrologic region, and even somewhat in the San Joaquin River hydrologic region, because we reside in both, that there were simply a lot of regional water management groups that were not able to get access to the funding, in particular in the ways that the funding went out to paid in arrears and things like that. So there were a lot of barriers, and there was frustration. And I think a lot of regional water management groups kind of threw their hands up saying, this is a dead end process. But I think that changed now with Prop 1. And I think that what we've seen is this theme, and that's progress. So the state has actually come up with some really innovative ways in ensuring that these funds get out to these regional water management groups. I know under Prop 1, we work very closely with the Sac River hydrologic region and the San Joaquin River. And I'm really pleased that every one of the regional water management groups that was ready to pursue funding at this time actually did receive a recommendation for funding coming out of Prop 1. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress. The state's been very helpful with trying to make these programs fit with some of these unique situations, because certainly in my primarily urban area, we have a lot of capacity to get into compliance, but in the more rural areas, they haven't. So I think we've made some progress. Unfortunately, there's sort of a downside to that. Next theme is limitation. Now, you mentioned that the bonds, they actually were on an upward trajectory. Starting in Prop 50, it was $500 million. Prop 84 was $1 billion that was made available. But when we went to Prop 1, we're back down to 500 million, and not to, obviously not to, besmirch that. It's fantastic, but we all know the 48 groups that we have out there, and now we're trying to deal with sustainable groundwater management. There's so much more need than there is available. And the concern obviously now is a continued downward trajectory with those funds, because we're not really hearing a lot today about what's the next iteration and where are we going. And then finally, I think the last theme is I think we're at crossroads, and you've alluded to this. So where does IRWM go from here? The governor's resilience portfolio has come out. There's a real emphasis now on climate adaptation, which is really important. And we do note that in IRWM, the bar there for understanding what might happen with climate change and those assessments has been increasing. So I think the IRWM groups that have been established and now have been functioning for well over a decade together have built a tremendous amount of capacity, and it seems like they should be very well positioned to move forward. And again, if that's where we start to focus, is shifting to climate adaptation, I think that everything that we're doing under this integrated water resources is an absolute natural fit for that. And so now's the time to see where we're going to go from here. And so I'm excited. I know we're going to have a good path forward, but there's a little bit of uncertainty right now. So I think those are the major themes that I've encountered throughout that 15 plus years of doing this.
Okay, all right. Dave, got a question for you. We are in the early stages of SGMA implementation, and things are starting to get real now. But now that we're measuring things, we've got deadlines, we've got to do stuff. We've learned that we're using up too much groundwater. Not a surprise, but now we've had to quantify it, and now we're having to do things to stabilize it. What have you observed in these early stages is the greatest benefit to groundwater basin management thus far? And I'm going to invite you to continue that. You had kind of alluded to that meshing of integrated planning approach or a regional approach with SGMA. So what are the benefits so far? And is there a path forward with integrated planning in a SGMA world?
Yeah, thanks, Lance. As I think about the the advances that have been achieved over the last 5 years, now 6, I guess, since the act was passed. I kind of go back to one of the foundational policy discussions that took place. And obviously there was a great deal of debate during the drafting of SGMA as to whether or not, at what scale should we be managing groundwater? And there were lots of advocates for state level management and control. There were advocates for hydrologic region management scale. And I think we ultimately recognized that there was a lot of good work being done, both at the groundwater management level through AB 3030 and SB 1938, but also the connection with integrated regional planning. So we fought hard, but we ultimately achieved an acknowledgement that groundwater is best managed at the local level. And I think as we look at the early stages of implementation, we're seeing validation of that objective in its purest form. I will note that integrated regional water management plans and the development of them were pretty wonky. There were, the water agencies got it. There was a great deal of outreach in the Kings Basin in an attempt to help the public get it. But, again, it was really pretty process driven with the objectives of let's go get our share of the carrots. I've noticed also in conversations with local water agency managers, as you have acknowledged, who have had to shift into the SGMA gear, that IRWM had its own set of conditions and requirements, and some of those were less than desired. I think another area that we've made some significant progress is really in the area of public awareness, and like integrated regional planning, SGMA includes a condition that you conduct a robust outreach and stakeholder engagement process. And I think as we look over the past 5-6 years, we can see evidence of substantial conversations and efforts to reach out to the stakeholders and have real conversations about what groundwater is and what it means, and why stakeholders should care. I would argue, and I think the evidence supports, that more of the public today than ever before understand what groundwater is and why it's important to them. I think that local agencies are developing a much better understanding of the groundwater function within their respective planning areas. There's a tremendous amount of effort that's been put forth in modeling and developing sustainable management criteria that supports that ultimate pathway towards sustainable management by 2040. And all of that data is kind of driving the conversation. There's a lot of effort that's been put into some early discussions on what are the projects and management actions that individual GSAs are going to pursue. We've been involved in deep conversations about appropriate methods to allocate groundwater, how you track and potentially transfer groundwater credits where allocations are made across GSA boundaries and possibly even across subbasin boundaries. So a lot of effort going into, what do we do to achieve sustainability? And while we certainly have not surprisingly seen a great deal of emphasis on expanding the supply side through recharge and developing additional storage, there are real hard conversations already underway in terms of land fallowing, land repurposing, and what types of other actions can we do on the demand management side to achieve sustainability. So quite a bit of progress. Now, there's a lot to do. We're now, waiting for DWR to review and confirm that the plans meet the requirements of the Act. Some agencies are continuing to move forward with refinement of some of their basic implementation policies and developing projects where projects make clear sense. I guess the last point I will say, and I may have skipped over this when I was talking about IRWMs, We had the water agencies and the cities as water users deeply involved in the Kings Basin water process, but we couldn't get land use planners to come to the room. They just frankly weren't, I don't know if it was a resource or a bandwidth issue, but land use agencies just weren't engaged. We're now seeing land use agencies actively engaged in SGMA implementation because they recognize, you know, the change in the footprint, and particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, as land is repurposed and shifts away from irrigated ag to some alternative purpose. Thanks.
All right. Angela, how have you seen the community engagement involved in these two programs? So how have you seen with your work, especially with integrated plans we talked about integrated plans tackling climate change. And one of the other big issues that the state has really asked integrated plans to step up on over the years, and I think Rob, you'd alluded to this more formalization, is get out there and engage disadvantaged communities because they're traditionally just not heard from in this process. Especially, it's the same cast of characters trying to figure out the water supply for the state, and generally you've got a lot of underrepresented communities. So Angela, can you tell us about how integrated plans have really helped bring that conversation and bring people and those underrepresented people to the table and get them the help that they need? And are you engaging on the SGMA front, you know, with these SEAM efforts? Are they complementary? Are they talking to each other? What's happening?
Yeah, so when we were selected for the Proposition 1 Sustainable Groundwater Management grant, we have definitely seen on the SGMA side that there has been an evolving it's been an involvement of, you know, seeing more residents recognizing the importance of being more involved in groundwater, but also in regional water management planning. And we've seen that a lot with many of these communities that we've historically supported since 1965. Many of the communities that our community development department has assisted, these are some of the communities that really have been historically active in participating in many of these different conversations of not only groundwater, but also just like water quality issues as well. So definitely, you know, we do see that, and we see it slowly attracting more different disadvantaged communities, some that we haven't really helped throughout some of the programs that we have under our community development department. But what we've seen over the last maybe just a few months, couple of years, is that we see that many of these community leaders and communities that have been in this process are reaching to a point that they're burning out. So they get to a point where they no longer feel as if they have the capacity to kind of be part of these processes. So they no longer feel that they have enough commitment to be able to join GSA meetings. They don't have enough, you know, time to even participate in IRWM because they've reached a point where family commitments, work responsibilities, especially health complications, like can be such a detriment for them to continue participating in these platforms. And so with an example of a community in Tulare County, it's Sultana Mansin CSD, there has been one active board member that has been there for more than 25 years. So he's been there since 1996, and he has helped this community be involved in IRWM. He was getting familiar with sustainable groundwater management and, you know, seeing how that was going to impact their community water system. But they have been very active in the IRWM region because they had qualified for many IRWM funding for their sewer kind of projects that they wanted to help the community kind of receive upgrades. But he also recognized that for the amount of time that he has to be able to continue this, he knows that he's going to get to a point where he'll no longer be able to have capacity to be in these realms. So he has started educating his residents. He's started educating school representatives and teachers to kind of just educate them in this area, have them kind of join these meetings of IRWM, of SGMA, and start familiarizing themselves with this information, because at the end, you know, his goal is to have his community be sustainable. And so educating the community residents, the importance of having sustainability in their community, kind of really helps enrich many of these like springing opportunities, which we have had recently in one of our programs called Leadership Institute. We had a school teacher who joined a cohort, but also joined this board, be able to now learn about what's IRWM, learn about what's SGMA, and she has the drive to be able to give back to her community, but also give back to this board member that has been actively participating in IRWM and in SGMA for a very long time. So I feel that in this space, we still have a long way to go, not only because, you know, we know that there are so many active communities that, you know, are advocating for their systems, they're advocating for their own quality of life with, you know, having a clean water in their area. But we feel that sometimes the first approach into these new communities, we have to be able to ask them the question, what are your needs? And that's kind of just how we've been approaching a lot of these different new communities to be involved in IRWM, especially in the Madera Regional Water Management area. We've seen that not a lot of people actually know about this, and not a lot of residents in the city of Madera, some of the communities that are outside of the city of Madera, they're not as familiar with IRWM. And so really kind of, they don't even know who we are either. So it's kind of sort of, there's a really huge gap of education that's still missing in this area. And we've taken an approach to where we kind of step in and give them this platform of asking them, what are your needs? What are the issues of you engaging in this area? And then how do we eliminate those barriers so that we can help you stay engaged and help you have a confidence of being able to just kind of advocate for your own community. So thinking about it in a way, you know, I think a lot of us have gone through our steps of dating, you know, meeting a person for the first time. You know, we want to get to know their personality. We want to get to know, you know, what is some things that they don't like or they like. And so that's kind of that is really, I think it's a silly analogy to kind of put in this kind of platform, but it's an example of, you know, that I feel that you know, all GSAs and all IRWMs like should kind of approach communities by asking them that overall question. But I do see this as, you know, it's still going to be an evolving process, and it's going to be it's going to be more evolving down the road to build more community capacity, to build more leaders to be able to advocate for their needs, but also to really bridge the gap of collaboration between government agencies and community. So I'll leave it at that.
And I got a quick follow-on for you, Angela. So you've got communities who are stretched thin just to participate in integrated planning, which has been a tough road to get those people at the table, you know, since we've been something that the state has been asking us to do, and we're starting to actually really do it. Now, these folks are asked to participate in SGMA, and you're hearing they're getting burned out. There's just not enough time in the day. Do you feel that that's a competition between, you know, are you doing the IRWM thing? Or are you doing the SGMA thing? You can't do both? Are they complementary, or are they competing?
I believe they are complementary, and that's why the example with Sultana Mansin was one of the biggest examples that I could give on that discussion, because everything kind of has its waves of impact. And so when the board member looked at these two different avenues, he does see a benefit with SGMA and having residents engage in that. but then also sees the benefits of IRWM, you know, bringing more opportunity in their community to have funding for any project updates, or even the capacity to be able to help with bookkeeping and technical, managerial, and financial trainings for their own staff to be able to keep up with the water system. So I do see it as complementary. I don't see it as challenging. And I don't see it as a barrier for anybody to be able to participate. It's a bigger opportunity for the most part, to really kind of, you know, build that education and just build that knowledge for a lot of these residents that are new to this area. And so we've done that through our program called Leadership Institute. And this program's only been up for 2 years, but it's a staple for us to be able to really kind of teach a lot of these new residents that are new to the water world, but who are also taking positions on the board, or who are taking positions in a GSA for an advisory committee role, or even in an IRWM role. You know, we give them a platform for them to be able to learn how these two programs interconnect, and then how that can really help build their capacity to be able to provide more feedback about the overall disadvantaged community needs that are still, you know, needed in their area.
Okay.
I hope I was able to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to open up to a question for all three of you. You've been able to successfully leverage integrated plan and now Sigma, now that it's on the scene, and you have this on the ground perspective. So moving forward, how do you think that integrated plans and Sigma can be a force multiplier working together? And I'm just going to throw a straw man concept. You know, as we develop these management actions, we start measuring things. We realize we're using too much water as part of the GSP process, and we got to tell the state some management actions that we want to do to be sustainable 20 years down the line. There's probably gonna be a whole lot of things we got to do. Projects. Should those projects go through the local integrated plan? Is that maybe an avenue? I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as kind of a straw man to beat up. And if you've got some ideas on how integrated plan and Sigma can work together, maybe it'd be a force multiplier, love to hear it. Floor is open. Who would like to go first?
I guess let me start with some thoughts, Lance. I think as I mentioned earlier, I had expectations coming out of Sigma that there would be this natural connection between IRWMs and the GSA that was required. In fact, I thought the Kings Basin IRWM was going to become the Kings Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And instead, we saw this retraction. And if you look at the statistics across the critically overdrafted basins in the San Joaquin Valley, you know, there are 11 critically overdrafted subbasins. We formed 87 GSAs to develop 37 plans for that 11 basin area. So just everybody kind of retreated and started building their own plan and trying to figure out how they could protect their own resource. And then what we're now starting to see is a little bit of reaching out. I have thought about the importance of IRWM serving as perhaps a key part of the implementer of the projects and management actions. There's still, you know, big funding needs. There's still, you know, strong need for collaboration across multiple stakeholder groups to implement some of the pieces of a plan. So it's a natural connection for the two to come together and think about how can the IRWM help the GSA, or, you know, implement the GSP in a way that is consistent with broader stakeholder interests and goals. When you think about the people who are in both sides of those table, you're going to both sides of that table. There's going to be a lot of talking to yourself going on, right? I mean, I think about Kings River Conservation District and the role it plays in both the IRWM as well as the role it plays in supporting local GSAs. And so if we put GSAs and IRWM staff together, it's going to be the same group. So there needs to be a way for people to recognize that they have two hats, and there's an opportunity to kind of meld those together and complement through actions that are coordinated, complement some outcomes that achieve that broader objective of sustainability.
Okay. Rob or Angela?
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I think that the force multiplier effectively comes from that regulatory function of SGMA and really the requirement to get basins into sustainability. So you mentioned it in your introduction. IRWM has often been the warm fuzzy stuff. There's no requirement, to actually achieve the objectives, but you lay them out. And right, so to me, IRWM is more aspirational, whereas SGMA adds that oomph, that requirement now to it. And really historically, I think if you look at our region, again, we cover these 3 sub-basins. We've been doing it in practice. And so I think it's appropriate to have an IRWM at a large kind of umbrella scale that's really dealing with all aspects of the water resource. And then you have your sub-basins that are required to really comply with SGMA. And again, historically, we've had, for example, in the North American sub-basin, started a conjunctive use program more than 2 decades ago. And it has actually been so successful in bringing in surface water supplies in wet years that what those entities have been seeking through IRWM over the last decade is actually funding for additional groundwater wells. So it seems counterintuitive in the day of SGMA, where we're actually looking at a basin that we think we should be increasing groundwater production, again, to expand conjunctive use. In the South American sub-basin in the middle, they recently brought in a surface water project. Maybe you've heard of the Freeport Regional Water Project about a decade ago, to get surface water into that central part of the basin where there was some overdraft. But what they really kind of lack now is they've got this big backbone infrastructure. They need to start tying a lot of it together. And so their focus has been on getting small pipeline segments and interties to get systems better connected to distribute that surface water out. And then finally, in our Casumna sub-basin, sort of the most rural and agricultural, where you don't even have a public water system, with the exception of City of Galt. What you're really dealing with down there is a need to recharge a groundwater basin and very little capacity. So those groups have been working with us to get funding for direct recharge projects, such as breaching along the Casumnas River during flood conditions and creating both habitat and recharge opportunities. Most recently, we're dealing with some MAR projects, some managed aquifer recharge, and we've been able to help these agencies get funding. So, we like to see those groups deal with what their priority issues are, but then bringing it up to the IRWM. And again, I think that new requirement under SGMA adds that oomph that I think will actually help IRWM out a little bit as well.
Okay. Angela, you got anything to add?
I think with this area, for us at Self-Help, this has been something that we've really struggled with doing, and especially kind of on the scale of both a basin and a regional perspective, because a lot of the information that we have to kind of interpret for many residents, it's something that, for us personally, like, we don't really have those types of like engineering backgrounds, or even kind of like the scale of understanding, the criteria to be able to kind of help residents and communities understand the process like at its easiest. So, we do see that that when it comes to this, I think that's an area that needs to kind of be sort of talked about, but also rethought on exactly how can we be able to interpret this information about what's going on in SGMA or in their GSA and what's going on in the IRWM region, for folks to be able to understand the intention overall of just kind of these plans benefiting them. So I don't know what else to really add amongst just kind of how we've been able to utilize these kind of planning documents to help advance sort of just like the comprehensiveness of water management. I think that that's something that we have looked more in an opportunity to work with GSAs, to work with the IRWM groups, which, you know, I do work with the Madera group. Some of my partners in self-help, they work with the Tulare Current funding area to be able to break down all that information and really kind of give it as an easy read for residents to know at this large scale, how is this going to be important for me to stay engaged? How is this going to be important for me to know that there is sustainability for my community or for my water supply? So I think that is a long process, and you know, we all see that, you know, with IRWM, with SGMA, it is an evolving program. Like, these two are very evolving programs, and I agree with I believe I think it was Rob's point of view about seeing, you know, or I think Dave, one of those two, seeing these two programs being, one, the IRWM being kind of the platform for project management and actions, because that is something that many communities do kind of steer more towards. They see, you know, when's a project going to come down in my community, or when's this going to come? Most of the time, they kind of don't really see the criteria as something that kind of gives them the solution to some of their issues in their area. So personally, for me, I feel that that is an area that we can all collaborate and think about a little bit more to really kind of help residents understand this kind of area of water management in their communities.
Okay. Well, I've got a couple questions from the audience, and I'll try to it's rather a long one. I'll try to paraphrase it. SGMA has basically opened up collaboration amongst folks in local jurisdictions as a mandate. You've got to work together. The state said, draw a box around your boundary, and all the kids have to go in there. You know, mom puts all the kids in a room, and you've got to figure out something, or mom's, you know, which is the state board, is going to come in and get you. And so you've got these 260 new GSAs that are around the state. And a lot of times it's the same players that make up the integrated plan groups, is what the question kind of goes into. And it asks, what tools in the toolbox are available to keep these new silos that have been developed, that are probably, that do land within generally an integrated planning area? You've got separate and distinct new silos or new GSAs. How do you keep those folks working together? Is there a way to encourage them working together that's other than state money and funding? We've talked about how the integrated planning money is kind of waning. So is that the only thing that's holding us together? And actually, how do you counter? This is probably the bigger question. GSAs and GSPs are pretty supply oriented. It's like a little mini adjudication. And those of us who have lived through adjudications know that we all kind of, well, generally people scatter off, try to establish their water rights, and then bring in lawyers. And it's generally not a very collaborative process because it's more protective than anything else. How do we not have just created 260 new silos that are focused on water supply versus a more macro regional approach, which is focused on flood and waste and conservation and supply and quality and all those other holistic things that are part of integrated planning? It's a big question. What happens next? How do we not run off to our corners and focus on supply only when we're supposed to be managing by region and watershed and holistically and not just supply focused? Dave, you said you had a bit of an experience, maybe a little bit of disappointment. So what happened?
I guess I would argue that, yeah, and it's natural that the GSAs have started with, can we solve this on the supply side, right? And so a lot of the initial GSPs that are now under DWR review have a pretty strong supply side piece in it. But it doesn't stop there. And again, I think, as you mentioned earlier in your introductory comments, Lance, SGMA is more than just managing your groundwater basin in quantitative, quantity terms. There's subsidence and water quality protection and salt and seawater intrusion. They're, the 6 deadly sins that have to be dealt with. And some of those are going to require demand side actions. And so we're seeing those conversations. As I mentioned earlier, there are discussions about, ramping down pumping over the next 20 years that are hard to have, but they're being had in various GSAs in the San Joaquin Valley. I think the other point that I want to emphasize is that SGMA does require, the scale of success is not at the GSA scale, it's at the basin, the groundwater basin scale. And so in these places where we've got multiple GSAs working to create multiple plans, they have to show through coordination agreements and other evidence that when they are collectively implemented, the basin will be sustainable. And I think we should leverage that requirement into an opportunity, right? Into an outcome where, as you mentioned, those basins are typically closer to the scale that an IRWM has been developed. So we ought to look for ways that the IRWM and the GSAs can connect and create and support both supply side and demand side actions to achieve that broader goal. I do worry, I've worried since day one that money was the glue to the IRWM. And I probably said that in my office at Kings River more than once. And once the money ran out, what would happen? And I've thought about incentives. I don't know what they are. I think that's one of our big challenges is how do we create the incentive on the SGMA side of the ledger that replicates the broader, integrated planning engagement that we saw when there was money. And I don't know what that is. It typically is some kind of state policy that says we're going to manage at this scale. But as I mentioned earlier, SGMA was amended to allow these multiple GSAs, GSPs, and that's just a fact that we're going to have to deal with.
Okay. So you see networks forming within these GSPs, and there's a lot of overlap with the same folks that are with the same cast of characters in the integrated plan are probably the same cast of characters that are in those GSP areas, just integrated plans this big and the GSPs are much smaller. Are the conversations different? I think maybe that's something, we've talked about, the water plan and the resiliency portfolio, and the ethos and the mindset and the vision on those documents. This is the star we want to point our ship at. And we've really, the integrated plan practitioners that have been doing it for quite some time, since 2002, Prop 50, Prop 84, Prop 1, and all those iterations, and seen it change over time. We've seen that conversation change. You folks are also now in the trenches of this new SGMA program. It's fairly embryonic. It's starting to form now. How are the conversations different, and how do they compare with some of the visionary documents and policies that are being asked of us water managers from the highest levels of state? What's happening at those tables? The IRWM table and the SGMA table, are they different conversations, and are they congruent with what the state's been asking us to do?
So I'll answer for my situation. We are somewhat unique. I hate to call myself spoiled, but we do have a pretty good situation. We're not, a lot of SGMA, especially when you look at the San Joaquin Valley, it's sort of, I call it the managing to scarcity exercise. And I think Dave would understand that, right? I think that in the Sacramento Valley, in particular, in our situation where we've implemented conjunctive use programs, it's actually, I think, creates a lot of opportunity. And so what we have been doing, and so in the IRWM arena, through Regional Water Authority, the bigger umbrella, we've been working for the last few years on a water bank. And that's basically a sustainable storage and recovery program. We know that conjunctive use is the successful mechanism, in addition to all the other things, the water efficiency, as I've already alluded to. But we are holistically managing, but conjunctive use is really that most effective way to really line up and match your hydrology and then adapt to climate change. So what we're trying to do is create an incentive program to do more of it, because that's always the challenge when management is need driven, right? And you're only going to spend as much as you need to comply with whatever your situation is today. But I think to be prepared for the future, we need to be more ambitious in our region. And so at the RWA level, we've been talking about establishing this water bank and going through this technical work. And really, it's a program to store water first in wet periods, identify how much of that water is needed to ensure a sustainable groundwater basin. And then in dry years, we have that as a local resource, but now we can transfer surface water supplies on a temporary basis. So we've been participating in the dry year transfers program in 2018 and 2020 from this region. So we've been making water available to the San Joaquin Valley in these years. And so really that work has already been ongoing. At the SGMA level or the GSA level, all of those sub-basins understand that they will play a part in that, right? That they're going to have management at their levels, and they're all going to be doing something slightly different because, as I mentioned, there's difference between going from north to south in our region. So they're going to have a responsibility to make sure that the basin is being managed sustainably as we operate this program. But the discussions are different right now. The GSAs are really focused on complying, right? And kind of understanding and getting in compliance with SGMA and doing the technical work. And there's this one thing of uncertainty that we don't know about, right? It's we know where we stand today. We're in fantastic shape, but we don't know what the future looks like. And so we're still working on all of those technical analyses, building our modeling tools to conduct climate change analyses to understand where we think we might be in the future. But really, you mentioned there's a touchstone, and it's around this water bank. So we think that we're in a position that not only we're going to be able to resolve our own issues, but we're going to be able to help other areas as well. So I think that that's really important. I know that a lot of areas can't do that, but we're really excited by it, and that's the conversation that's happening here.
Okay. So a question came up that regarding metrics, and metrics are important. If you can measure it, you can manage it. If you can measure it, you can showcase it. And legislators really latch on to numbers and figures and statistics. And one of the issues we Rob, you'd kind of mentioned, I'd kind of talked about integrated plans have been kind of like the warm hug. Hey, we can do this together, and there's a lot of benefits. And a lot of it is probably reduced legal fees, frankly, because it gives us an excuse to work together, distracts us with doing things right instead of just calling our lawyer and we fight out everything in court. Hard to quantify. And early in the process, integrated plans were very data driven, and that didn't really go anywhere. I'm not saying not go anywhere. It didn't go maybe as far as it could, because it's a constant struggle for us integrated plan practitioners to really prove up all the benefits. And a lot of them just aren't dollars or acre feet saved and those kinds of things. It's a lot more qualitative. SGMA is a little bit different. It's hard numbers. What do you see has been a challenge with proving or showing or demonstrating the value of integrated plans? The early emphasis on numbers that really didn't go as far, they kind of petered out and for integrated planning purposes. And now we've got SGMA, which is, hard empirical data. Two different types of programs. They're related, absolutely, but some of the ones with integrated plans are really hard to quantify. What's that challenge been? Or how do you prove the value of integrated plans if you can't point to a number?
Good question. My experience with the Kings Basin IRWM was that there was a significant amount of effort put into developing data, right? We developed an integrated surface groundwater model, which frankly was a great outreach tool, because we ran some graphics that showed, absent any action, that the cone of depression sucked the city of Fresno and Clovis right down into the hole. And that's a little bit more graphic than really what it showed. But it just showed this expanding groundwater problem that was going to capture and affect a lot of different stakeholders. And that we use that as a tool to get agencies to recognize the vision and the opportunity of IRWM. Granted, IRWM at the Kings was all about, let's identify the various projects that we have in mind, primarily for water supply enhancement. So it was heavy emphasis on supply side. And then let's show this collaborative, collective support for that effort so that we can get more than our share of the IRWM funds that were available from the state. And frankly, that business model proved to be very successful for the region. some of the data that the IRWM and the Kings created was then morphed into the Sigma planning effort by the individual GSAs. In some cases, they developed their own data sets and continued, like I said before, to build their own case as to why they should get how much of the groundwater that's available in the subbasin. But a lot of that data started with, data that the IRWM had collected. And frankly, I think the project lists that the IRWM has are very similar to the project list that the collective GSAs and the Kings have for projects and management actions to achieve sustainability. So there is a natural connection, at least there. Although again, I think most of the effort that I'm aware of has really been focused on, as Rob points out, let's get our plan developed. Let's make sure it checks all the boxes. Let's make sure that DWR and the state board are happy and that we can continue to move on down a path. So, I don't
project list. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Should the project list you just mentioned that comes out of this GSP process, things you have to do to be sustainable, why would it not be in the integrated? Why would it not just flip over into the integrated plan? Why would a GSA not make that effort to go, here's our project list, and we need to make sure it's in that integrated plan as well? Are we doing that? Why wouldn't we do that?
I believe we're doing it, but again, I haven't been in the trenches in the Kings Basin in a while, but it's just logical that they should be. Now, I will say that, well, I'll stop there. We should be. Yeah,
we should be. So you're doing it. Maybe so I guess that was a challenge to the other 259 GSAs out there. If your project list you're developing to make yourself sustainable and not invoke the 6 deadly sins of undesirable results, if it's not in the integrated plan list, it really should be. Go talk to your integrated plan folks and make sure it's on the list.
Well, that is happening in our region, Lance. But admittedly, when we designed our IRWM, it was intended to be a living document with a living process for adding projects. Not all IRWMs are created that way. Some are static. So I'm not sure that everybody would be able to do that. But yeah, it's obviously a great idea. And at an absolute minimum, you should be communicating those projects to the IRWM group, right? Because that's what IRWM is all about. It's about communication. And sometimes you're missing a connection of the value of a project. And that's what we're trying to get done, right? It's so what if you could create more benefit from your project? It actually makes it more compelling, potentially more fundable by finding partners, grant funds and such, but even just locals, right? That need to fund certain things. So, we always encourage that level of communication.
I've got a follow on. One of the biggest hallmarks of, and I think the benefits of integrated plans, it's taken many, many years to develop the stakeholder base, this engaged stakeholder base that makes up the region. How do you continue and not lose that? As the money dries up, as the attention is more on the regulatory stuff than the voluntary stuff, just entropy starts pulling these groups apart. We've got busy lives and it's hard. You have to throw energy in, throw heat in to keep that group together. How does Sigma keep that group together? Or are there ideas? Should a integrated plan have as part of their stakeholder group, should they have the GSAs plugged in as a standard thing a couple times a year to share what's going on, the ideas, what they've learned? How do we not have entropy pull apart these stakeholder groups? And I would say that the folks at the GSA tables, they look a little different than the ones at the integrated plan tables, especially with the special interest groups and maybe the disadvantaged communities and some of those folks. You see the water supply folks there for sure. But I think we're missing some people in the seats. So how do we keep that thing together and not have entropy pull it apart? Yeah, and just ideas. Throw out some wild concepts. Get us thinking.
Well, I think for starters, it's actually finding the right balance of not burning people out from the number of meetings that you have. So again, we do our semi-annual meetings, and you actually have to effort into designing that meeting. It really has to be interesting to everybody. So we try to communicate as much information from the different stakeholder groups as possible. And I didn't mention, but we also participated in the development of a stormwater resource plan recently. And again, that was a natural fit in our region because of the stakeholder base that we'd already brought together over those years. So that's how we try to do it. Is we keep the the investment of their time at a minimum, but we carefully set up our meetings and canvass around to find out what's going to be of interest to folks. And we're not always talking about money, you know, so that's sort of how we've been able to keep it fresh. You know, and as I said, this group has basically been meeting continuously since 2009 when we started this effort. And I still regularly have 25 to 30 plus people show up at every one of our IRWM forums.
Angela, you've been in the trenches. You've been working with integrated plans. You see Sigma kind of coming on the scene. Everybody's invited, right? But do you have a different folks showing up? Do you have any ideas on a way to kind of keep people engaged in the Sigma process with limited time and availability? Should those groups work more closely together, or should there be like every once in a while a group meeting? Do you have any thoughts?
I know that with Madera's project, that is their intention with one of the projects for the Proposition 1 Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program was to be able to dedicate a specific coordination group to be just fully disadvantaged community representatives, and allowing that space to be very exclusive for those that are kind of on the listserv for the IRWM region, and then especially for those that sit on the IRWM board, to be able to kind of listen in on just the overall needs, because this group has finalized their needs list since, I believe, between 2018 2019, but they have recognized that there is an evolving, you know, format of needs that they may have missed from the time that they were putting that together. So I do see that with having maybe a dedicated group can really help with kind of keeping those residents engaged. And especially we see that with the North Fork Kings GSA, they have a very dedicated Rural Communities Advisory Committee. Also in the Kauai Subbasin, they have their own dedicated Stakeholders Advisory Committee, and that really kind of shapes overall that kind of space for the disadvantaged communities, even for small farmers, even for those that are on private wells, to be able to come together and kind of, you know, talk amongst themselves to really say, you know, does my needs overlap with your needs? You know, is there something that we should probably speak more broadly and take it back to the GSA, or even in the IRWM region? Should we talk more broadly on these needs and take it back to the IRWM board? But I do also see that in the space of nonprofits, we've seen a lot that incentives hasn't been something that has been brought up a lot, and hasn't been talked about a lot, you know, because a lot of us in different spaces, we are getting, you know, not to say it in this context, but we are getting paid to be there. We are getting paid to sit in these meetings, to be able to listen in and be able to just kind of take whatever back to our organizations to be able to shape further the policies. A lot of these residents don't receive almost the same that we receive. Many of these residents take their time out of their own personal lives, out of their work, to go to these meetings and really kind of be there for not only themselves, but also for their neighbors to be able to take information back. So to talk about an incentive is kind of something that, you know, we're open to having that conversation with some GSAs. We are open to having those conversations with IRWM groups that, you know, that see us as sort of kind of the facilitators to be able to begin that discussion. So, you know, I leave it for this group to really kind of think about that, you know, offering an incentive, whether it's a small incentive, because residents will feel grateful for, you know, being appreciated for their time being there, and they can see the value with just however, you know, small the incentive is. They'll see a very great value in being able to feel accepted, but also feel, you know, that their feedback is, you know, worthwhile to really shape the policy.
So, you know, again, I mentioned earlier that the integrated plans have got a built-in stakeholder inclusion tool. You know, we've been working on it for a year, and outreach, and it's established. It's been around for a long time. It's been pretty successful. So I guess this is more of a me editorializing. This is an invitation for GSPs to, you know, book an annual meeting where you showcase your results, or at least an annual meeting at the local integrated plan stakeholder group. They'd probably love to see you. You'd see some new faces, and you'd be talking to people about what's going on in their own backyard. And that's maybe a way that you can we can weave integrated plans and GSA activities together. It's a built-in stakeholder outreach machine, that the state's invested in, and a lot of people have put a lot of sweat equity in. Use it, use it. Another question that came up on the screen here was 99% of the population is covered by integrated plans, and integrated plans do things that are different than SGMA, a little more holistic, and we've got climate change and a real focus on disadvantaged communities now. So if integrated plans cover 99% of the population, GSAs don't. GSAs and adjudicated basins, and the populations that they do overlap on, the GSAs do different, and adjudications do slightly different things. What are your thoughts? I mean, now we have more, we're getting back to like white areas on the map again. Does this panel have any, and if integrated plans wane, what do we, in a very short, because we're running out of time, if that happens, in one or two sentences, what do we lose? What are we losing after our initial efforts in 2002? Now it's going to be 2020 and 2021, almost 20 years later. What's the potential of loss of value? A couple sentences. Dave, I'm going to pick on you. You're first.
I think we potentially lose the collaboration and the good outreach and the good foundation that IRWMs have established, and that's replaced with this regulatory environment that SGMA creates for the GSAs. That we've talked about overlap. We've also talked about disconnects. I think we lose that. I think it's going to be important, frankly, to define. I will argue that GSAs do cover 80 to 90% of the groundwater use in the state. It's not land area, it's groundwater use percentages. So there's adequate coverage. But we've got to figure out that relationship between the two. I made a note here that GSAs have a much bigger to-do list than IRWMs do. And we've got to figure out, how they can support and interact with each other.
Yeah, and echoing Dave, you certainly lose that capacity that's been built, and that's critical. But really, we can't just manage groundwater as the resource, right? That is a fool's errand. It's the comprehensive water resource system with all of its attributes. And to include, recently Orth has been focused on working more close with the upper watershed, and just the recognition of all the value as we deal with climate adaptation and such, the forestry health and such, and the importance of that. So without that full resource management, you can't be successful at the groundwater management level. So you really do need to maintain these sorts of institutions that we have in place through IRWM. Okay.
Angela, SGMA versus integrated plans kind of fading out. Spent a lot of years putting these stakeholder groups together. What do we lose?
Well, I absolutely agree with both Rob and David. Like, we lose the collaboration. We lose sort of that opportunity to really bring all of these different stakeholders to the table, to really kind of overlap the needs and overall kind of the goals from these programs. But I think we lose something very important, and that's the educational piece of it. We've worked extensively in the IRWM projects to really strive to create very easy to read educational materials for residents to really kind of begin their own process of learning. And, it also, the one thing that I feel like we will lose is just more opportunity to engage, more opportunity to bring more disadvantaged communities or even tribal communities that may still not be knowledgeable of IRWM, who may not be knowledgeable of SGMA. That is one of the biggest losses, because California is massive, and the San Joaquin Valley is massive too, with so many disadvantaged communities and so many, wide areas that, we still haven't even scratched the surface of, what's still out there. What are the needs that are still out there that really need to be captured and really need to have the opportunity to put their thoughts together to really have the agencies help them. So yeah.
Okay, I think we're almost at time, so I'm going to do a quick wrap up. I think we've indicated that SGMA has some very specific charges, and it's a little different, very complementary to integrated plans. Integrated plans have got a 20-year investment. If you can do things voluntarily, it's a better way of doing business. You spend less time in court and a lot less money on lawyers, and ultimately you probably get more creative and results out of working together. Rob indicated that SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, groundwater, and integrated plans, they're different. Integrated plans are an absolute holistic approach that take all aspects of water resource management. SGMA is a big part of that, but it is a subset of the solution. And the state has kind of indicated we need, we've learned that it needs to be managed locally and it needs to have an integrated approach. We have everybody at the table. And so SGMA is wonderful. It gets us down the road. We need that type of stick to kind of do the right things, but it is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, not the Integrated Plan Act. Also, we've talked a lot about tribes, disadvantaged communities, and we even mentioned climate change. And those have been things that have been really developed in the integrated plan process and are very, very important issues for the state, and maybe our SGMA might not be able to solve all those issues. So hopefully we've established the real value of the last 20 years of effort by the state and local people on the ground, the practitioners and the proselytizers like we have here on the screen. Don't let entropy pull that work apart. Chris, I think you've got a couple of quick announcements, and I'm going to concede the floor. And thank you all for joining us today. I think Chris has a few words for the send-off, but thank you all for this panel, and thank you all for your time. Chris?
Yep, I am just going to set up this slide. Whoops. Okay, yes, I want to say thank you to my panelists and thank you to all of you who took the time to attend today. We hope we found this webinar beneficial. Again, this is the first in a series of webinars, and we'll be scheduling additional webinars quarterly in December, March, June, and September. And since this webinar is designed to benefit you, we'd like to do a poll on what topics you'd like in the future. So if you have a moment before you go, if you could fill this out. If there's not a topic that you have an idea for and you don't see it on the list, you can email me at maven@mavensnotebook.com. There is no subject too down in the weeds for me to consider. And as we're waiting for everyone to respond, I want to thank you all for joining us, and also thank you, my webinar series partners, IRWM Roundtable of Regions, Local Government Commission, NGO Groundwater Collaborative, and the Department of Water Resources, who is a sponsor of the Groundwater Exchange platform. And if you did not receive an invitation directly to this webinar and would like to be on our mailing list, please email me at mavens@mavensnotebook.com. A recording of this webinar will be posted on my YouTube channel and on the Groundwater Exchange shortly in the future. Great, thank you for your responses. We will try to look at these webinar topics, and I thank you again for attending. Have a good afternoon, everybody.